Hello guys, so today we're going to be going over Unit 3, which is also Chapter 3, Biological Molecules. And we're going to be talking about, out of these different sections, this video is going to go over the carbon atom in organic molecules, formation of organic molecules and macromolecules, and carbohydrates. Now, biomolecules are considered organic molecules, and the main four are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acid, which is also DNA. And so we'll talk about the first one on the video, and then we'll go over lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids in class, along with ambiogenesis, which is a process of forming these four biomolecules. And then we'll have a nice activity to do afterwards. Now, when we start talking about this, we ask ourselves, why are these guys important, right? And if you can see here is a nice tablespoon of sugar known as sucrose going into coffee. And what we'll figure out is sucrose is really what's known as a disaccharide. And that can break down into glucose, and glucose can be used for people doing activities. It's called essentially cellular respiration, which is going to allow it's a process that allows larger molecules like glucose to be broken down into smaller molecules that we can store for energy. Now, these biomolecules, it's not just carbohydrates. There are things like proteins and fats. And those items allow to make up components within the body or organisms and cells to allow for structure and function. So those are important in creating things like elephants. And not just that, carbohydrates can be, and fats and proteins can be yummy as well. So, a lot of times you can find these different biomolecules on nutritional facts. So if you see here, you can actually see initially that these are going to help consumers know what they're eating. And so this is a container of cookies, or this nutritional fact is on the back of a container of cookies. Now, you always have to be careful with these things, because what we consider a serving size and what an actual serving size is a little different. And we'll talk about that more when we get into enzymes and energy and cellular respiration. But if you notice here, you can see that essentially it's composed of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And those are 3 out of the 4 biomolecules. So they can give you an idea of what is incorporated in this food. And then we can talk more about what's appropriate and what is not healthy for you. So let's get into what the carbon atom is and organic molecules. So carbon's important. Now, organic molecules are those things that have carbon and hydrogen, right? So something like this, CH4, this is what's known as methane. So as you can see here, you have 1 carbon, 4 hydrogen. So the combination of those two, essentially, under definition, makes it an organic molecule. So if I write something like carbon dioxide, is that an organic molecule? Well, no. It has carbon, but the oxygen in it essentially makes it so that it's not organic. There's no hydrogen in there, is what I mean. And so this is going to be considered an inorganic molecule. So all organic molecules contain carbon, and that is very abundant in living organisms, i.e. organic molecules, And large organic molecules are called macromolecules. And you can think of macro, the term essentially means big. So like macroeconomics is looking at like large scope economics. And so if you remember this, carbon, if you remember the atomic number, is 6, right? And the atomic mass was 12. So we can figure out on here proton-wise, we have, because the atomic number gives us the number of protons, right? We have 6. Electrons are 6 because on the periodic table, they are neutral. So there's the same. Positive equals negative, right? And then when you go on neutrons, essentially it's protons plus neutron equal the atomic mass. So this again is 6. And we've already joked on why that makes organic chemistry just terrible, right? 666. Anyway, let's take the electrons and figure out how many valence we have. The first shell has 2, so the second shell has 4. And so when we actually want to do a Lewis dot structure, remember, we have a dot on each side. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have 4 essential orbitals here, right, that have 1 electron each. So this guy can have up to 4 different bonds. So, as I said, carbon has 4 electrons in its outer shell. So essentially it can make up to 4 bonds, right? It needs a total of 4 more for it to be stable. If you remember what we were talking about, in the shells, you need 2 in the first shell to be stable, then 8, and then essentially another 8. And this is about where, if you're taking a chemistry class, in some elements it can be a little tricky. So that's as far as we're going to go, right? They can make either single or double bonds. For instance, if you have this carbon, and let's put another carbon next to it. This guy can bond, but do you see how this one and this one could come together? So essentially from there, you can make a bond. And then if you look at it even more, so this guy and this guy can make a bond. So you can have there. This is an example where you would have 3 bonds, right? So it can form single or double, or in very rare cases, triple bonds. Carbon forms what are called non-polar bonds or polar bonds, depending on what it's combined with. For this case, if you guys remember when we talked about polarity, as in polar and non-polar covalent bonds, as you notice, this bond is between 2 non-metals, right? So essentially, if we're looking at this, let's do what color? Let's do a blue, right? If I had something like, and I'm going to put this over here, carbon and carbon, that's an example of a non-polar bond, right? They have the same electronegativity. If you have carbon and oxygen, right, this essentially is going to be considered a polar bond because this has more electrons than this guy. So that's what they mean by can form polar or non-polar, right? So carbon chemistry is interesting, right? As unique properties of an organic compound, but it depends on if you have a carbon skeleton, which is just a bunch of carbons. So what do we mean by carbon skeleton? Well, you're going to have a bunch of these guys lined up over and over and over. And essentially, its unique property depends on how many carbons you have and what is attached to it. Right? And so that's what we're going to look at as we go through here. And it's a pretty cool thing. So essentially here, we can look at the carbon being attached different ways. For instance, here, you have this carbon skeleton, and they're just carbons linked one after the other. Here, you can essentially, the carbon skeleton can have double or triple bonds, essentially. Here, you're looking at the carbon skeleton having branches attached to it. So they may be on branch, which means something like this, that's just lengthwise, but then they can have these basically atoms coming off of it. And then some of the favorite here, they can be cyclized or in circles. So they can be where they have double bonds like this, what's considered benzene, or they can just have stuff that doesn't have double bonds. So this kind of just shows, and if you remember when we were looking at actually making molecules with gumdrops, we saw some of these. So if you remember, this was the good old methane here. And remember, I made it look like an upside down umbrella. So this just kind of shows you, and you guys don't need to know these shapes. I'm just showing you so that you can kind of, if you like to see things in kind of a 3D spatial representation, you kind of get an idea what they look like, right? This is ethane. And if you know, essentially, anes on the end, and this is a chemistry thing, just tell you that they're just single bonds. Enes say they're double bonds. You don't need to know that as well. I just like to tell people if they're ever wondering. And so you can see down here some double bonds. And so essentially we talk about all this so that we can talk about how macromolecules are put together. So you can have macromolecules or molecules in general that have the exact same what's called molecular formula. So that's the idea of what atoms are in them, but they can be put together differently, right? And so we're going to talk about what are known as structural isomers and stereoisomers. So with that being said, I want you guys to consider how that can be essentially happening, how you can have the same atoms and how they can be arranged differently. And that's where the next one is the next mini lecture is going to start.